The day Jasper Wilde planned to ask Josephine Tate to be his wife, his entire world came to a screeching halt. One minute, he was standing in the town square, the sun warm on his back, a silver ring heavy in his pocket. The next, a shadow fell over him. A woman he'd never seen before strode into the center of town like she owned it. She was tall, nearly 6 feet, with shoulders wider than most men in the territory. Her arms looked like they could wrestle a steer to the ground and win. She stopped, planted her boots in the dust, and pointed a calloused finger straight at him. Her voice boomed across the square, silencing every conversation. "Jasper Wilde," she declared, "I'm here to claim your hand in marriage." Not ask, claim, like he was a stray horse she was rounding up. Jasper froze. The ring he'd so carefully crafted for Josephine felt like ice in his palm. He could feel the eyes of the whole town on him. Whispers started like dry leaves skittering across the dirt. He looked over at the fountain where Josephine stood, a vision in her yellow dress, her face pale as milk. But what truly chilled him to the bone wasn't the woman's size or her impossible demand. It was how she said his name, his full name. Jasper Thomas Wilde. A name only one person had ever used. A name he hadn't heard spoken aloud since his mother was buried 15 years ago. And then, the woman smiled. It wasn't a mean smile. It was something far more unsettling. A smile that said she knew a secret about him. A secret so deep, he'd forgotten it himself. The ring slipped from his numb fingers, hitting the dust with a soft thud that sounded like a gunshot in the dead silence. She started walking toward him, slow and deliberate, and Jasper realized the scariest part of all this wasn't what she was doing. It was a strange, faint flicker of something deep inside his chest, a feeling he couldn't name, a feeling that was terrifyingly close to recognition. Just 3 hours earlier, Jasper had been on top of the world. He'd spent the morning polishing the silver ring he'd made from his grandfather's watch chain. He'd practiced his proposal in the mirror until the words felt as natural as breathing. "Miss Josephine, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Josephine Tate was perfect. The banker's daughter, gentle, polite, with hands that had never known a day of hard labor. She was his ticket to a quiet, respectable life, the kind of life he'd always craved after the chaos of his childhood, a life where there were no surprises. But now a surprise the size of a mountain was standing 10 feet away from him, watching him scramble in the dirt for the ring he'd meant for another woman. "You don't remember me yet," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "But you will." The townsfolk started backing away, not wanting to be near whatever lightning was about to strike. Mrs. Henderson practically dragged her kids into the general store. Old Pete the prospector spat a stream of tobacco juice and shuffled off toward the saloon. Even Pastor Mike, a man who loved a good public spectacle, gathered his robes and made a hasty retreat. Only Josephine remained, frozen by the fountain, clutching her little beaded purse like a lifeline. Her eyes, wide with confusion and hurt, darted between Jasper and the stranger. Guilt twisted in Jasper's gut, hot and sharp, even though he had no idea what he'd done. "Miss," Jasper said, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again, forcing strength into his words. "Miss Bishop, I think there's been a terrible mistake. I don't know you, and I have certainly made no promises to you." The woman, Leona Bishop, let out a soft chuckle. Her smile widened, showing teeth white enough to bite through bone. She reached into a leather satchel slung across her chest and pulled something out. A piece of paper, yellowed with age, folded into a neat small square. "Oh, but you have, Jasper Wilde," she said, her voice dropping, taking on a strange, warm tone. "You most certainly have." The sound of the paper crackling as she unfolded it was the only sound in the world. Jasper's eyes were glued to it. The ink was faded, the handwriting was clumsy and childish, but it was disturbingly familiar. He could see his own name scrawled at the bottom, a signature from a life he'd long since buried. Leona held it up for him to see. Then she began to read. Her voice was clear and steady, carrying across the square like a judge reading a verdict. "Jasper Thomas Wilde promises to marry Leona Bishop when they grow up." The words hit Jasper like a punch to the stomach. He remembered. A hot summer, the smell of honeysuckle and creek water, He was 8 years old, a scrawny boy with scraped knees and a wild imagination. And there was a girl with tangled dark hair and fierce eyes, but that wasn't the worst part. Leona kept reading. Signed in blood, witnessed by the creek behind the old Miller place, summer of 1854. Signed in blood, a memory sharp as a shard of glass, pierced through the fog of years. He remembered the girl, Leona. He remembered the secret hideout by the creek. He remembered her father's knife, the one she'd dared him to use. He remembered the sting as he'd sliced open his own thumb, pressing it to the paper next to hers. A promise made in blood, he'd said, could never be broken. He heard a small choke sound from behind him. It was Josephine. A gasp and a sob all in one. He turned and saw tears streaming down her perfect porcelain face. Her whole body was trembling. Every instinct screamed at him to go to her, to comfort her, to tell her this was all a ridiculous mistake, a childish game from long ago. But when he turned back to Leona, the look in her eyes stopped him cold. It wasn't madness, it was pain, old and deep, and it was mixed with a resolve that looked like it had been forged in fire. This wasn't a game to her. Her broad shoulders didn't just carry muscle. They carried the weight of a promise she had never for 1 second forgotten. I kept my end of the bargain, she said, her voice quiet now, but more powerful than when she'd been shouting. I waited for you. After your parents died and you were sent away, I waited. 15 years, Jasper. I watched other men come calling. Good men, who offered me an easy life. I turned them all down, because I had a promise. She carefully folded the paper and tucked it back into her satchel. I'm 23 years old now, and I'm done waiting for you to remember what honor means. The accusation hung in the air, thick and heavy as summer humidity. And in that moment, Jasper saw his carefully constructed future, his safe, predictable life with Josephine, shattering into a million pieces. He looked down at the ring, half buried in the dirt, a promise broken before it was even made. When he looked up again, Josephine was gone. The space where her yellow dress had been was empty. He saw the hem of her skirt disappear around the corner of the general store. She hadn't screamed, hadn't argued. She had just walked away, and her silence was the loudest condemnation of all. A hot rage, born of confusion and shame, flared up in Jasper's chest. He rounded on Leona. Now look what you've done. That woman was going to be my wife. Leona didn't flinch. Her dark eyes met his, calm and unyielding. No, she said simply. She was going to be your escape. There's a difference. The words were a slap in the face, mostly because they were true. Josephine was safety. She was predictability. She was a wall he could build around himself to keep the ghosts of his past at bay. You can't just show up after 15 years and call in a debt on a childhood game, he yelled, his voice raw. But even as he said it, he remembered the solemn look on his 8-year-old face, the deliberate way he'd pressed the blade to his thumb, wanting the pain to make the promise real. Leona stepped closer. He could smell the scent of dust, leather, and something else. Wildflowers. It was a smell that tugged at something deep within him, a memory just out of reach. She was so close now, he had to look up to meet her gaze. Her presence was overwhelming, solid as the mountains that ring the valley. I didn't come here to destroy your life, Jasper, she said, her voice softening, becoming almost gentle. I came here to save it. Before he could even begin to ask what she meant by that, the sound of hoofbeats cut through the air. Not one horse, 3. They came out of the afternoon heat shimmer at the edge of town, moving with a grim purpose. Jasper's blood ran cold. He knew those riders, the Morrison brothers, Carl, Billy, and Hank. They were hired muscle, known for their short tempers and the trail of broken men they'd left across the territory. They'd been lurking around town for a week, asking questions about old land deeds. The eldest, Carl, swung down from his horse. He walked with a swagger that said he'd never lost a fight in his life. His eyes landed on Leona, and a slow, predatory grin spread across his face, a grin that made the hair on Jasper's arm stand up. Well, well, Carl drawled, his voice like gravel scraping on rock. What do we have here? If it ain't the little lady who's been asking questions about the old Bishop property. Leona's body shifted. It was a subtle change, but Jasper saw it. Her shoulders squared, her weight settled onto the balls of her feet. She went from being a woman standing in the street to a wolf preparing for a fight. I wasn't asking questions, she said, her voice perfectly even. I was making statements about my family's land. Carl let out a harsh laugh that had no humor in it. Your family's land? Sweetheart, that land belongs to my uncle. Been tied up for years, and some folks, well, they think it's time it was settled for good. He took another step toward her, his brothers spreading out to flank him. The air crackled with a new kind of tension. This wasn't about a marriage contract anymore. This was something older, something dangerous. Jasper felt his own muscles bunching, his fists clenching at his sides. But before he could move, Leona put a hand on his chest. Her palm was warm and solid through the thin fabric of his shirt. The strength in that simple touch was startling. Stay back, Jasper, she said, her eyes never leaving Carl Morrison. This isn't your fight. Carl's grin widened. Actually, he drawled, it might be more his fight than you think. See, we heard your little announcement, and we're thinking maybe this fella needs to understand exactly what kind of trouble he's getting himself tangled up with. He reached out, his dirty hand moving to grab Leona's arm. What happened next was so fast Jasper almost didn't see it. Leona moved like a viper striking. She caught Carl's wrist in midair. There was a sharp twist, a sickening crack of bone, and the biggest of the Morrison brothers was suddenly on his knees in the dirt, his face a mask of agony and pure shock. The kind of woman, Leona said, her voice as calm as if she were discussing the weather, who doesn't appreciate being touched without permission? Billy and Hank went for their guns, but Leona was already moving again. She shoved Carl away and spun, putting herself between Jasper and the other two brothers. Her movements were fluid, graceful, and terrifyingly efficient. Her hand dropped to her belt, and a long, wicked-looking knife seemed to leap into her palm. Now, gentlemen, she said, that same calm authority ringing in her voice, I suggest you get back on your horses and ride out of town. Before this becomes a conversation none of us wants to finish. For a long, stretched-out moment, nobody moved. The only sound was Carl Morrison, gasping for breath as he staggered to his feet, clutching his broken wrist. His face was beet red with rage and humiliation. But as he looked at Leona, standing there with the knife held loosely at her side, Jasper saw another emotion flicker in his eyes. Fear. This ain't over, Carl spat, but he was already backing toward his horse. That land's gonna change hands, Bishop, one way or another, and your boyfriend here might want to think twice about whose side he's on. They mounted up and galloped out of town, leaving a cloud of dust and curses hanging in the air. Jasper just stood there, staring at Leona. She hadn't even broken a sweat. There was no fear in her eyes, no adrenaline shakes, just a quiet, focused calm. Where did you learn to do that? He stammered. She finally turned to look at him, and her expression softened. The same place I learned that promises matter, she said, from people who taught me that if you love something, you have to be strong enough to protect it. She took a step toward him, and in the golden light of the late afternoon, he could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. He could see the stubborn set of her jaw, the strength in the column of her neck. He was seeing her for the first time, not as an interruption, not as a problem, but as a person. When she spoke again, her voice was low, almost vulnerable. The Morrisons aren't wrong about one thing, Jasper. You're going to have to choose a side. That evening, Jasper found himself walking. He didn't know where he was going at first, but his feet seemed to have a mind of their own, carrying him down a familiar path. Out past the edge of town. He ended up at the creek behind the old abandoned Miller place. The memories were stronger here. The cottonwood trees whispered in the breeze. The massive oak where he'd carved his initials as a boy still stood guard over the water. It was here on a fallen log by the creek bank that he and Leona had made their promise. And she was already there, waiting. She'd changed out of her dusty traveling clothes. She was wearing a simple brown dress that somehow made her look less intimidating and more real. Her dark hair, free from its braid, hung loose over her shoulders, catching the last of the sun's rays. I had a feeling you'd come here, she said, not looking at him, just watching a stone skip across the water's surface. You always did your best thinking by the creek. He sat down on the other end of the log. The space between them felt charged, full of unspoken questions. I'm starting to remember, he admitted, his voice quiet. It's like a dream. But I can't remember why you left, why your family just disappeared. She tossed another stone, watching the ripples spread. My father owed money, she said simply, to the wrong people. The Bishop land, our land, has the best water rights in this valley. That paper is valuable. But paper doesn't mean much when a man like Samuel Morrison decides he wants what you have, and you can't afford the lawyers to fight him. Her story came out in a steady, measured tone, devoid of self-pity. They'd fled in the middle of the night, leaving behind everything they owned. Her parents had caught a fever a few winters later up in the Colorado Territory. Neither of them survived. I've been on my own ever since, she said, her gaze fixed on the far bank. Working, saving, getting strong, getting smart, doing whatever I had to do to get back here and reclaim what was stolen from us. The pieces clicked into place. A cold, heavy understanding settled in Jasper's stomach. The Morrison brothers, he started. They're Samuel Morrison's nephews, she confirmed. He bought our land for pennies on the dollar after he ran my father off. Carl and his brothers are just his attack dogs. They make sure nobody else gets any ideas about questioning the sale. He stared at her, at the incredible, unbreakable will that had carried her through 15 years of hardship, all leading back to this one small town, to this one patch of land. And you think marrying me helps you? He asked, the question sounding foolish as soon as it left his lips. She finally turned to look at him, and the hardness in her expression was gone. In its place was something raw and honest. I think, she said carefully, that some promises are worth keeping just because they were made. The land is just land, Jasper, but a man who keeps his word, a man who honors a promise made by a boy, that's rarer than gold. She reached across the log and put her hand on his. Her fingers were calloused and strong, but her touch was surprisingly gentle. I'm not asking you to fight my battles for me. I'm asking you to remember who you were, before you decided that being safe was more important than being true. The creek murmured beside them. A mockingbird started its evening song in the trees above. Jasper looked at their hands, his smooth and clean, hers marked by years of struggle, and he felt a profound, aching shame for the man he had become. He was about to speak, to say something, anything, when the sharp sound of a horse's whinny shattered the quiet. In an instant, Leona was on her feet, her hand instinctively going to the knife at her belt. They both expected to see the Morrisons back for revenge, but it was a single rider, a lone figure emerging from the twilight shadows of the trees. It was Josephine Tate. She wasn't wearing her fancy yellow dress anymore. She was in a dark blue riding habit, practical and severe. She sat on her horse with a straight-back confidence Jasper had never seen in her before. Her face, usually so soft and placid, was set in hard, determined lines. I thought I might find you two here, she said, and her voice had an edge to it, a sharp, metallic quality that was entirely new. Jasper scrambled to his feet. Josephine, I can explain. There's no need, she cut him off, swinging down from her horse with an easy grace that surprised him. She walked toward them, her boots making soft sounds on the damp earth. Her eyes, those gentle blue eyes, were burning with a strange new fire. She stopped at the edge of the creek, a few feet from them, and looked from Jasper to Leona and back again. Miss Bishop, she said, her tone formal and crisp, I believe you and I need to have a conversation. About Jasper Wilde. Leona raised an eyebrow but stood her ground. I'm listening. I've known Jasper for 2 years, Josephine began, her voice ringing with clarity in the quiet clearing. And in all that time, I have never seen him look at anything the way he looked at you in the town square today, with that mixture of terror and recognition. He never once looked at me like that. The admission hung in the air, painfully honest. Josephine, that's not, Jasper started, but she held up a hand to silence him. Oh, but it is, Jasper. And I realized something else this afternoon. While I was sitting in my perfect room in my perfect house, I accepted your courtship because you were safe, because marrying you meant having the exact life everyone always told me I should want. She turned to face him fully, and he could see the glint of unshed tears in her eyes, but her voice didn't waver. But I don't want a safe life anymore. I want a life that makes people stop in the street and stare. I want the kind of love that makes a woman cross half the country, armed with nothing but a memory and a knife, to claim what's hers. She looked back at Leona, and a silent, startling understanding seemed to pass between the two women. Two sides of a coin, one raised in privilege, the other in hardship, but both forged from the same iron. So the question is, Miss Bishop, Josephine said, her voice sharp as a needle, what exactly do you plan to do with him now that you've got him? Before anyone could answer, the ground began to vibrate, a low rumble that grew steadily louder. It wasn't one horse or three, it was a dozen, maybe more, and they were coming fast. Leona's face went grim. She recognized the man on the lead horse, even in the fading light. Samuel Morrison, she said, her voice a low growl. It seems he's decided to settle this tonight. Samuel Morrison rode into the clearing by the creek as if he were a king returning to his castle. His hired guns, a dozen of the meanest-looking men Jasper had ever seen, fanned out behind him, their hands resting on their pistols. Samuel was older than his nephews, with a thick silver beard and eyes as cold and dead as a winter sky. He swung down from his horse with the easy arrogance of a man who had never been told no. Leona Bishop, he boomed, his voice echoing across the water. I heard you were back in my territory stirring up trouble. Leona didn't even blink. She stepped forward, planting herself directly in his path. This isn't your territory, Samuel. This creek runs through Bishop land. Always has. Samuel let out that same cold, humorless laugh Jasper had heard from his nephew. Bishop land? Girl, your daddy was a fool and a debtor. He signed that property over to me, fair and square. I've got the papers to prove it. Papers signed under duress don't hold up in a court of law. A clear voice cut through the tension. Every head swiveled. It was Josephine. She stepped forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with Leona, her chin held high. My father is a banker, Mr. Morrison. I know a great deal about legal documents, and I also know a great deal about fraud. Samuel's icy composure finally cracked. A dark flush crept up his neck. This doesn't concern you, Miss Tate. You best ride on home to your daddy. Actually, Jasper said, his own voice surprising him with its steadiness. He moved to stand on Leona's other side, forming an unlikely, unbroken line against the dozen armed men. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but for the first time in his adult life, he wasn't afraid. It does concern me, because I'm choosing my side. For the first time all day, Samuel Morrison looked genuinely shocked. Boy, you have no idea what you're stepping into. I know exactly what I'm stepping into, Jasper replied, the words feeling truer than anything he'd ever said. I'm stepping into being the man I should have been 15 years ago. Samuel's hand drifted down toward the butt of his pistol. Instantly, the clearing was filled with the metallic clicks of a dozen hammers being cocked. The air was so thick you could taste it. But Jasper didn't back down. He felt a fierce, bright fire ignite in his chest. This was what it felt like. This was courage. Here's how this is going to go, Samuel said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. Miss Bishop here is going to sign a new paper, relinquishing any and all claim to this land. Then all three of you are going to ride out of this valley and never come back. Or this is going to get very, very unpleasant. Leona didn't even look at him. She was staring right at Samuel. No, she said simply, here's what's going to happen. You are going to go to that safe in your office. You're going to take out the original deed to this property, the one signed by my grandfather. And then you're going to explain to all these good men how you forged my father's signature on a bill of sale 15 years ago. Samuel's face went from red to ghostly white. You can't prove any of that. And then Leona smiled. It was the most terrifying, triumphant smile Jasper had ever seen. Samuel Morrison, you were always too greedy for your own good. Did you really think I'd come all this way without proof? She reached into her satchel. She didn't pull out the childhood pact. She pulled out a bundle of letters, tied with a faded ribbon. "Turns out," she said, her voice ringing with righteous fury, "my father kept copies of everything, including the letters you sent him, the ones where you threatened to harm his family if he didn't sign over the land." She untied the ribbon and began to read. She read Samuel Morrison's own words, his own threats, his own vile promises of violence, all documented in his own handwriting. As her voice echoed through the clearing, Jasper saw several of Samuel's hired guns start to shift in their saddles. Their expressions changed from menace to discomfort, then to disgust. They were hired thugs, but even they had a line. "This is nothing," Samuel snarled, sweat beading on his forehead. "Forgeries, all of it." "They could be," Josephine agreed, her voice pleasant and calm. "They absolutely could be. If my father hadn't witnessed the original loan transactions himself. Banking regulations, you understand. He keeps meticulous records. He always thought the deal smelled rotten. He's just been waiting 15 years for someone with the courage to ask the right questions." It was the final blow, the 1-2 punch that shattered Samuel Morrison's empire of fear. Two of his men holstered their weapons, turned their horses, and rode away without a single word. Then 3 more followed. Within a minute, it was just Samuel and his 3 nephews, facing down the strange trio by the creek. Even Carl, Billy, and Hank looked like they were having second thoughts. "You think this is over?" Samuel screamed, his hand hovering over his gun again. "You think you can just take what's mine?" "I think," Jasper said, taking a step forward, "that you're outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and out of time. And I think if you draw that weapon, you'll discover that the boy who made promises by this creek grew up to be a man who keeps them." Samuel stared at him, his cold eyes searching Jasper's face. Whatever he saw there, it was enough. His hand dropped away from his gun, defeated. "This isn't finished," he muttered. But the threat was empty. He was already backing toward his horse. "Yes, it is," Leona replied, her voice filled with quiet, hard-won finality. "It finished the day you decided your greed was more important than other people's lives. Now you know better." Samuel and his nephews mounted their horses and rode away, swallowed by the darkness. Silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the gurgling of the creek and the sound of their own breathing. The sky was now a deep purple, studded with the first stars of evening. Jasper could hear his own heart beating, a steady, strong rhythm. He could smell the wildflowers in Leona's hair. He could feel the weight of a lifetime of fear lifting off his shoulders. Josephine broke the silence, a small, genuine smile on her face. "Well," she said, "I suppose congratulations are in order." Jasper turned to Leona. He saw her, truly saw her, for the first time. Not just the warrior, not just the promise keeper. He saw the tired, vulnerable woman beneath it all, the girl who had spent 15 years alone, fighting her way back home. "Miss Bishop," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I believe you said something earlier about claiming my hand in marriage." Leona stepped so close he could see the starlight reflected in her eyes. "I did," she said softly. "But now, after all this, I'm thinking I'd rather you offered it freely." He took her hands in his. They were strong and warm, and they felt like coming home. "Leona Bishop," Jasper Wilde said, the words coming straight from a part of his soul he thought he'd lost forever. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Her answer wasn't a word. It was the way she stood on her toes and kissed him. A kiss that was both fierce and gentle. A kiss that tasted of dust and tears and 15 years of waiting. A kiss that was a promise all its own. When they finally broke apart, Josephine was already back on her horse, silhouetted against the moon. "I'll have my father send all his documents to the territorial courthouse in the morning," she called down to them. "Consider it a wedding gift." And with that, she turned her horse and rode off toward the new, uncertain, and wonderfully unsafe life she had chosen for herself. 2 months later, Jasper and Leona were married right there, by the creek, under the watchful branches of the old oak tree. The Bishop Ranch, returned to its rightful owners, began to thrive. And Jasper learned that the safest place in the world wasn't a life without surprises. It was standing next to the person you were always meant to be with. If you enjoyed this story, there's a video on your screen right now with another unforgettable tale where fate, courage, and a long-lost promise collide in a way you will never see coming. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what we have in store. Your support is what allows us to keep finding these incredible stories. Thanks for listening.